we come to what I called on the outline the enigmatic synoptic question. Enigmatic is just a big word that means difficult. It's a very difficult question. As I said, it's terribly involved. Books and books and books have been written upon it. And I don't think that you're that familiar with the question, since we've not done any New Testament studies in this church. So let me start by saying this, and I know that this will bear witness with you, and it'll make a lot of sense, and it'll be meaningful to you. This question, the synoptic question, is to New Testament studies what the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch is to Old Testament studies. Now, you remembered what a question that was, and we spent a lot of time on who wrote the Pentateuch, and all these theories, and all these books that were written. All right, now you've got a sister, a cousin to go along with that. In the New Testament, the big question is the synoptic question. Now, that's meaningful to you, right? Because you know how big the question is of the authorship of the Pentateuch for Old Testament studies. So the Lord gave that to me as maybe the best way to incite your minds and to remind you of this, to put something permanently in your memory concerning the synoptic question. There are lots of questions about the New Testament, just like there are lots of questions about the Old, a lot of critical questions, a lot of questions that are historical in nature. The synoptic question happens to be a question of authorship. And that's exactly what that monumental Old Testament question is all about. It's a question of the use of sources. That's the same as the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch. It's a question of the source of dating. You know, when was which done, and who did it, and who borrowed from whom, and who was the redactor, and is there anything left of the original, or is it just something said later on, well, Moses wrote the Pentateuch when Moses really didn't. That was said by the scribes and in Ezekiel's day, years and years in the future. Same with New Testament. Did Matthew write it? Did Mark? Did Luke? Who came first? Who borrowed from whom? It's a very, very involved question. There's a new textbook out on it. I'll just mention this. I can't highly recommend it because although he's conservative, Bob Stein, and he teaches at a conservative seminary, Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, he studied too much in German scholarship. I happen to know that's where he's done a lot of his studies at Tübingen. And in his book, although he gives a fairly good, well, a very good survey of the whole synoptic question, and it goes back, well, really back to the 2nd century A.D., but especially the last couple of hundred years after the Enlightenment in the period of higher biblical criticism, it has been a very explosive issue and question, the same as the question concerning the authorship of the Pentateuch. He's been too close, though, to critical scholarship, and it bleeds through in his book. But that's this new book published by Baker, The Synoptic Problem and Introduction by Bob Stein. If you happen to have your interest stirred deep enough in these next few studies that we'll do on the question of the Synoptic Gospels, and you want to really know a lot of the background, then maybe this is the book to get. But make sure that you interpret this book in light of the conclusions we reach here in this class. If you have those conclusions, I think you'll have the biblical answer to it, and you won't fall for some of the things that Stein has to say. Certainly a better book written by someone much more conservative, but one I think you'd have a problem finding today, is Ned B. Stonehouse's The Origins of the Synoptic Gospels. Some basic questions. Ned B. Stonehouse was the successor in New Testament studies at Westminster Seminary to J. Gresham Machen. Machen held the New Testament chair for a number of years there and then died suddenly. And Ned Stonehouse took over the New Testament chair and has spent most of his life, he died also suddenly back in the early 60s, with the question of the Synoptic Gospels, origins of the Synoptic Gospels. Stonehouse is much more conservative. This book was written several decades ago. Bob Stein's is a new book. He hadn't bought in, Stonehouse, to a lot of the newer theories. Really, they're not newer, they're older theories, but he just didn't feel that it was his calling or necessary to do as much study as Stein has felt to be able to be conversant with their view, and in attempting to be conversant with their view, you've actually picked up part of their view. I think you'd probably have a difficulty finding this book. That's why I can't highly recommend it. But Stein's book, he's going to give you all of the information you'd ever want to know about, and you can see it's a big, thick, hardback book. That's how, and this is just one. Many, many books have been written on the synoptic problem. Stein gives you, I've been in Bethel Seminary, and one of the people I happened to, my wife and I visited there one time, one of the people I happened to hear was Stein. We had our pick of different professors back when we lived in Minnesota to go in and sit and listen lecture, and I can't remember what he was lecturing on now, but we sat in a classroom, and if I thought of it, I could come up with it, but it was a New Testament critical question, and they were really getting into it, all the students debating with Stein about this question, and I think they were probably all wrong about it. Stein's written several books, one on the parables and one on difficult sayings in the Gospels, so he's a well-known New Testament scholar, but it's not a book that you'll fall in love with. All right, let's get into some of the background, the history. You're asking, well, what is the enigmatic synoptic question? It's very involved, and we're going to try to be brief. Brief might mean a month, but that's still brief. 4 studies on this terribly confusing question. If it's terribly confusing, you might ask, well, how significant is it really? Well, it's not terribly significant. Once we reach our conclusions, you'll see, well, whether I knew that or I didn't know that, it wasn't really going to hurt or affect my Christianity or my study of the New Testament. Often that's what the scholars do, talk about things that are a waste of time, that aren't worth talking about. I wouldn't say that purely that it's a waste of time to talk about the synoptic problem, because it is a very interesting question. It concerns the origin of the first 3 Gospels. It concerns any interdependence of the Gospel writers. It concerns redaction of them, or the sources that were used by the 3 Gospel writers. And then when it really becomes involved and personal, it concerns what we call in New Testament studies the ipsissima verba versus the ipsissima vox. Do we have the voice of the Lord, or do we have the words of Jesus in the New Testament? The answer to the ipsissima question may surprise you. And the answer to that has shaken some people's faith, and they get their answer through a lot of critical scholarship, and sometimes critical scholarship can come up with the right answer. But because it's cast in such a negative framework, it shakes the faith of some people. But it won't be any problem, you'll see as we get there. Well, let's start back with some history. If I go too fast on any of this, because it's probably, especially as we get a little further along, it'll be unfamiliar territory, then you can slow me down. Eusebius was a church historian back in the early 4th century A.D., and he wrote a book entitled The Ecclesiastical History of the Church. And in this, really the first attempt at church history, he didn't have very much ground to cover, like a New Testament or a church history writer would today. He tells us that by the end of the 2nd century, our Gospels and none else were universally recognized as the inspired authoritative ones. He implies in making that statement that other Gospels had been written. Not necessarily that others were available in his day, but he knew from a study of history that, in fact, other Gospels had been written. But he tells us that by the end of the 2nd century, these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these 4, these alone, and none other, were universally recognized as the inspired ones, the authoritative ones. In other words, the genuine, true ones. And they have been, among the New Testament books, never controverted in the church. It's not like a 2 Peter or a Jude or a Hebrews or a book of Revelation that we looked at in biblical literature under canonicity, books that had been controverted in the New Testament. The so-called antilegomena books of the list of origin. There were some books agreed upon and some books not agreed upon, definitely not agreed upon, and some books about which people didn't have an answer. We gave you that before under canonicity. Well, the 4 Gospels, none of them fit under any category except these were incontrovertibly the inspired and authoritative ones. They held a special place in the hearts of early Christians because once the 12 died off, these became the basic references to the life of Christ. That's probably why others made an attempt to write something about the life of Christ, and it's also probably why these were never controverted in the church. You would hardly want to cast out one of the four Gospels, since these give us our basic references to the life of Christ. Once the 12 died, we could even go a step beyond that. Once the original eyewitnesses died, and there were many more than that. Remember, he sent out 70, and there were many more than that. I mean, you had the 12, the 70, and I'm sure there were others. Well, the women weren't included in that, and they were certainly present. So you've got more than the 82 people that those two lists would give us in number anyway, the 12 and the 70, who witnessed things in the earthly life of Christ. Once the eyewitnesses died, then you've got to have some connection to the earthly historical life of Jesus, and that would be the gospel accounts. So in the middle of the 2nd century, Justin Martyr freely quotes from what he calls, and I quote, the memoirs of the apostles. That's a rather well-known quotation, rather well-known term in Gospel and New Testament studies. The memoirs of the apostles. That's what he calls them. They weren't called Gospels until a little later. Remember, Matthew wasn't sitting down while I'm writing the Gospel according to Matthew. He's writing as he's inspired by the Holy Spirit, and he uses the term gospel, but gospel didn't mean the name of a book. It meant the news, the good news of Jesus. And they were simply called gospels as literary productions much later. And he said concerning the memoirs of the apostles, they, and I quote, are the gospels and were composed by the apostles and those that followed them. He means they were the gospels, they were the tellers of the good news, and were composed by the apostles and those that followed them. Now, about the year A.D. 170, a man by the name of Tatian, T-A-T-I-A-N, who was a disciple of Justin Martyr, composed the first of what we call harmonies of the Gospels. And it was known as Tatian's Diatessaron. Which came from two Greek words that meant through the four. Through the four. It really went back to a musical instrument, but it has reference to the fact that the four Gospels are used, woven together to gain one picture in chronological, sequential fashion of the earthly life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Tatian was a disciple of Justin Martyr, and he composed the first of what we call a harmony of the gospel. And he named it his Diatessaron. It had a profound influence, not upon later Greek copies of the Greek New Testament, but upon the Syriac Bible, Syriac copies of the Greek New Testament. And I think we also have that on an earlier tape in biblical literature. Now, really you have two different types of what we call harmonies. You have the true harmonies, and that's what the Diatessaron was. It was a true harmony. And you have synopses. S-E-S. Synopses. Most of what you find today as a harmony of the gospel is, in a truer sense, a synopsis. And I'll try to give you a brief understanding of the difference between the two. It's rare to find a true, pure harmony today because people are after a different purpose than they were in Tatian's day, and I'll explain why and what that purpose was as we go along. What Tatian wanted to do was put before himself four different manuscripts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he didn't want to leave them set four together so that you could compare what one had to say on the same account versus another, versus another, versus another, such as the feeding of the 5,000, which is one of a very few stories that happens to be told in all four of the Gospels. It's told in four different ways. If you left all four of those manuscripts before you and gave yourself simply four vertical columns on a page so that you'd have four horizontal readings of the same story, you could compare them then. You wouldn't really have a harmony. A harmony attempts to weave the narrative together that's found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, leaving out anything that is duplicate or that's unnecessary. He took the 3,780 verses in the four Gospels and wove them together to equal 2,769, losing about 27% of the four Gospels. The Gospels, as we have them, have 3,780 words: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Tatian's Diatessaron, which contains Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, however in a woven together fashion, has 2,769 verses. So you see what he's done. If you've got something over here in Matthew, the same story is told over here in Mark. And then these lines are peculiar to Mark, this line is peculiar to Matthew, and these are found in both. Well, you simply put these together, which ends up crossing out two of those verses, and bring Marks that are unique and have Matthews that are unique, so you've got one thread that runs together with nothing being repeated twice. In other words, you don't tell the story of the feeding of the 5,000 four times. You only tell that one time. And you take whatever is unique to each of the Gospels and put that in your one telling of the story. Whatever is duplicated or whatever is found in triplicate, you simply excise and remove. Now, the reason that Tatian was doing that was really several-fold. In the first place, people were after a chronological account, a strictly chronological account of the life and ministry of Jesus. And that has its purposes and benefits, I suppose. You want to know what came first or what came before something else. We would maybe be after that today on occasions, in addition to the four that we have and the way that we have them in our own Bible, so that we can know what the chronological order of the Lord's life and ministry was. But Tatian, I think, was after it for another reason. Those were the days, friends, before the invention of the printing press, when paper was expensive, when expert writing was simply not available in many places, and if Tatian could put all four of the Gospels in a single volume that was 27% less than what you'd have otherwise, you're saving paper. You're saving paper, you're saving time, you're saving the expense of energy. You don't have to write down as much, copy as much. And Tatian's Diatessaron found a very, very widespread following. People really liked what they read. It was easier to read. You didn't have to try to remember, now, was that in Matthew or Luke or Mark? Or where was that? It was in the Gospel, one Gospel, all four of them, to be sure, woven together. You didn't have to try to remember, well, now, where was that? It was there in the book somewhere. And you simply follow along in chronological order, and you would come across it sooner or later. Paper was expensive, or the parchment that was written on is difficult to obtain. That's not just something that we have like we have today. So they were trying to save time and save paper or parchment and save expense also. Over the next few centuries, other attempts were made at a harmony until finally people decided that what they were after really was not a harmony, because that was putting things simply in strict chronological order. What they were after was a synopsis that wouldn't leave things out that are in duplicate or triplicate in the Gospels, but that would put them all there for comparison's sake. So a synopsis, or the synopses, the history of synopses, their origin, they arose over a more scholarly desire to have the 3 or 4 Gospels intact, and for us to be able to look at them perhaps on a single page and compare the differences and the similarities. So in Tatian's diatessaron, in other words, what I'm saying is you would simply have one unbroken, woven together narrative. What you end up in a synopsis with, you'll probably have 3 or 4 vertical columns like this, and then you'll have it as told horizontally by Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. Matthew may tell a story, Mark doesn't have that story. All right, then whenever Mark starts telling one, Luke happens to have the same thing, and so does Matthew. And then maybe John is telling this down here, and the other 3 don't have it. Those are called harmonies of the Gospels today, but really what they are synopses of the Gospels. The first most famous synopsis of the Gospel was written by John Calvin. He's better known for a lot of other things than writing harmonies of the Gospels, but Calvin, in his commentaries on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, gave us our first formal, famous synopsis of the Synoptic Gospels. And I brought along with me today, not Calvin's, but several of the synopses. I think that they're probably all called harmonies, though, really misnamed harmonies, but we understand what they mean. Harmonies of the Gospel. So many of them are available today. Many have been written over history. Wien's Harmony of the Gospels is a harmony that puts the Gospel, the 4 Gospel accounts, in their chronological order, as well as in this synopsis type order with vertical columns and horizontal discussions of the passages. This is according to the RSV text. You've got Baker's Harmony of the Gospels by Davies, which is based on the King James Version of the Bible. You've got Pentecost, a harmony of the words and works of Jesus Christ, based on the New International Version. So here you've got your columns, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then if John gives a story, they'll have John up there. You see the columns. You've got Thomas and Gundry's A Harmony of the Gospels based on the New American Standard Bible. Now you know all about all these translations. And you've got harmonies or whatever you want, concordances or whatever, that correspond to all of these harmonies. If you don't have a harmony, the classic of all time, the one I would recommend, is A.T. Robertson's Harmony of the Gospels. It is very beneficial to have something like this alongside your other studies whenever you're trying to do some type of work in the 4 Gospels. I see that this is one of the first books I bought. My date in it's November the 12th, 1977. It's one of the earliest books I bought whenever I started doing some study. I bought it. I still see the sticker on the front from the Baptist Bible bookstore. I paid $6.95. You'll pay $13 for it today if you want it, but I paid $6.95 back in the good old days for it. Actually, it's a Harmony of the Gospels done by John Broadus, B-R-O-A-D-U-S. Broadus was a famous New Testament and Greek professor at Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, beginning back in 1859, and taught there for decades, up into the late 1800s. One of his assistants, one of his young assistants late in his life, was A.T. Robertson, who upon Broadus's death took over the chair of New Testament and Greek at Southern Baptist Seminary, and there himself remained for decade after decade after decade. He's a very famous name in this century in New Testament studies, A.T. Archibald T. Robertson. Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville is not a good name today. They've gone neo-Orthodox. Back in the days of Robertson, however, this is back in the 20s, they were a very 20s and 30s. They were a very conservative school. They're not that way anymore. Broadus is the one who did this harmony in the 1800s, upon the suggestion, by the way, of his young assistant, A.T. Robertson. Once he died, and it went through many different editions and republications, and A.T. Robertson himself revised it and has published it this way, and it's been the standard since, I guess, the 1880s. It's been on the scene for about 100 years. If you end up buying a book like this, you get a whole treat in the back of the book with all types of discussions of things like, well, he gives you a history of the harmony of the Gospels, and I'm sure you'll find Tatian in there. He gives you a history of the Synoptic criticism and question. Just a whole package of concise studies of interesting New Testament questions. He gives you a study of the two genealogies of Christ. You know, Matthew gives one and Luke gives one. Well, how did they get those, and why the differences? Seems like Luke's giving a different one than Matthew gives. He gives all the different views on that. He gives his discussion of the probable time of the Savior's birth. He gives a long discussion of the feast in John 5:1. What type of feast was that? Was it a Passover? The feast of John 5:1 is one of the crucial discussions in New Testament when you're trying to date the length, the extent of the ministry of Jesus. Was it 3.5 years, as has been believed for a number of years? Was it really 3.5 years? Well, that whole question depends on your interpretation, among other things, of the feast in John 5:1. So you're not familiar with all these issues because it's New Testament study. You'll start memorizing some of these things like you did names for the Old Testament discussions in higher criticism, the authorship of the Pentateuch. He's got a discussion of the Sermon on the Mount. You know, Matthew gives one, the Sermon on the Mount, and Luke, the Sermon on the Plain, and they've got differences and they've got similarities, and they're found at different places in those two Gospels. Are they two different sermons delivered on different occasions? Are the same sermon repeated twice? Or is it the same sermon, you know, Jesus repeated it on a couple of occasions, but it's the same one? Or is it the same sermon and Matthew and Luke simply give their own representation of it? And what else does he have back here? The hour of the crucifixion, the time of the resurrection, the length of our Lord's stay in the tomb. These are important New Testament questions. You know, he said that as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. Well, if you have him crucified on the typical day of Friday, and you have him raised from the dead on early Sunday morning, that really only equals 1 day, 1 full day, and that's Saturday, and only 2 nights, Friday night and Saturday night. And he said 3 nights and 3 days. So many people have wrestled with that issue. What's something else? There was one other thing. Oh, he's got, I don't see it here, but I know he's got back here the question of whether or not Jesus ate the Passover. That's number 11 on notes on special points. Did Jesus eat the Passover? You know, you read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, he did, because that's when he institutes the so-called Lord's Supper. It's there when they're eating the Passover. But over in John's Gospel, they already have Jesus arrested and everything, and the Passover, they're still looking forward to the eating of the Passover, like in John chapter 18. So what was that he ate? Did he eat it on Thursday night rather than Friday? That gives us our 3 nights in. And you could, you know, construct 3 days out of that as well. Therefore, what the Lord ate, was that really not the Passover, but a pre-Passover meal? These are important New Testament critical questions. But surely one of the most important ones is the synoptic question. And what you get in A.T. Robertson, if I could find a place where the 4 would agree, that's going to be hard since they rarely agree. No, that's still only 3. But anyway, you get your 3 columns like this. And rather than a harmony, which would rule out anything that's duplicate or triplicate, you simply weave all that together. You've got Matthew the way he said it, Mark the way he said it, Luke the way he said it, so that you can compare the 3 accounts. Technically, this is known as a synopsis of the gospel. You have them in Greek. Kurt Aland did one back in the early 1960s that's been reprinted and revised several times, I think all the way up into the 1980s, which is in Greek, which is what you really need to study if you're studying the New Testament, is in the original language. But I would recommend this. It's based, by the way, on the English Revised Version of the 1880s. That's because that's when Broadus and Robertson were writing. And it's never been redone or updated to bring it into a KJV or some other translation. That's not a big problem anyway, what translation it's done in, as long as it's halfway reliable, and the ERV, the English Revised Version, is. What's important is that you don't have to hold your finger in 3 or 4 different places and try to flip back and forth and read the accounts. I mean, it's completely invaluable to have a harmony, a synopsis, whatever you want to call it, of the Gospels when you're wanting to compare the sayings or the works of Jesus as they're recorded by all 3 or maybe all 4 of the Gospel writers. Otherwise, you're flipping back and forth. You have a synopsis you can see on one page, and your eye can follow from one column back and forth. Now, what word was included? What word was left out? You say, well, what difference does it make? Well, we'll see as we go along. Back to Tatian's diatessaron, though. Once the 4 Gospels were bound together in that form, and then later, once the 4 Gospels were bound together as separate books. You see, Tatian is trying to save paper, and you don't have the binding together of the 4 Gospels until probably a long time after Tatian's day. They floated around as separate books. You didn't have one whole New Testament, one whole Bible put together. Tatian was trying to do people a service by giving them the whole Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in one volume. Once Tatian had done that, later, once the 4 Gospels in the non-Tatian form, in other words, in the separate individual existent form, became bound together in one volume, people immediately noticed a similarity.
For the continuation of this message,
people immediately noticed a similarity between the first 3 Gospels as opposed to the 4th Gospel. And these 3 came to be known as the Synoptic Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You see, if you weren't real familiar with the Gospels, and maybe more particularly if you didn't have them all in one volume, the 4 Gospels, you would have to go back into your memory as you're reading Luke and question yourself, well, now, was that in Matthew? Was that in Mark? Is there anything in John that reads similarly? Think if you didn't have all 4 of them in one book where you could just read in one volume, bound in one volume, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You could read through them or turn back and forth. You only had one available. Well, you'd be totally dependent on your own memory or someone else's around you as to whether or not this is similar or different than one or more of the other Gospels. Once you got all 4 of the Gospels as separate Gospels but bound in one volume, then people immediately noticed Matthew, Mark, and Luke read very similar to one another. John doesn't. That was one of the first things that people noticed. Now, we just take that for granted. I hope you already know that today. We kind of take that for granted. That was a discovery for them. Matthew, Mark, and Luke read very similar to one another, and John doesn't. John doesn't read like any of them, and none of them read like John. So they came up with a name for the first 3. They call them the Synoptic Gospels. Now, the name wasn't actually used until much later in history, but they meant something similar whenever they referred to the first 3 Gospels. Synoptic is really a Greek word, or it comes from 2 Greek words, synopsis, which means soon with, or together. And opsis, what do you think opsis? We get things like optical, optician from that. Well, it means, view, or it means to see, eyesight. To view, to see, together is what the word means. Together seen. In other words, as applied to the 3 Gospels, the word came to mean taking a common view. Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to take a common view of Jesus' life and ministry, as opposed to the 4th Gospel. That, by the way, is the name by which the Gospel of John was often distinguished from them. They were called the Synoptics. John wasn't called John, he was called the 4th. John's gospel was simply called the fourth gospel. Often you see that in modern writings today. They don't call John's gospel John, they call him the fourth gospel. The fourth gospel is a word that is intended to separate in your mind it from the other three, the three bound together as the Synoptic gospels. The actual term, as we use it today, synoptic, dates only so far back as to the days of Griesbach, who first used that in 1774. Griesbach lived from 1745 to 1812. J.J. Griesbach. Now you know what the term synoptic means. You might not know what the synoptic question or problem is yet, but you know what the term synoptic means: to see together, to view things together, taking a common view of the life and ministry of Jesus. Applies to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You already knew that, right? Did those three Gospels read very similar to one another? Let's mention some of the similarities. Those three Gospels, basically, now there are some differences, but let me outline it in generalities. They start the story of Jesus' ministry with the baptisms of John. They have John baptizing in the wilderness. That's in Matthew 3, in Mark 1, and in Luke 3. That then leads into the start of Jesus' public ministry, found in the same chapters that I just mentioned. The stories that are told of Jesus' teaching and Jesus' healing are concentrated in the locale of Galilee. Jesus is rarely seen elsewhere until you get to the end of those three Gospels than Galilee. He's almost always in Galilee whenever he's teaching or whenever he's healing. The focus of those three Gospels is the final trip. It's a very climactic episode. The final trip that Jesus makes from Galilee across Jordan through Perea down to the Jericho area, the plains of Moab, back across Jordan again, past Jericho, up the 2,500-foot ascent to the city of Jerusalem, where he experiences the Last Supper, the Passion, and the Crucifixion. You see, those Gospels read very similar to one another in these regards that I've just given you. They go from the baptism of John through Jesus' ministry in Galilee, with all of them focusing on the final climactic trip that Jesus makes to Jerusalem, where he experiences his passion and his crucifixion. Now, contrast that with John's Gospel. John's Gospel places hardly any emphasis on the baptism of John the Baptist. The fact that he is baptizing, however, is mentioned on a couple of occasions. You certainly don't have Jesus being baptized by John, coming up out of the water, the dove descending upon him, and a voice from heaven. You have that almost identically in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You don't have that in John. John does not cast Jesus' ministry in Galilee. Jesus is always seen in John's Gospel operating in Jerusalem. So John doesn't really have a great focus on the final trip to Jerusalem because Jesus is already there. Now you see, this is one of the things that began raising problems in people's minds. And since you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke agreeing with one another, at least one author has at least two others that will agree with him. Matthew has Mark and Mark has Matthew and Luke has Matthew and Mark agreeing with him. John doesn't have anyone agreeing with him. Therefore, the gospel that's come under the most criticism has always been the Gospel of John. You don't have other things to agree with him. John must be wrong. I mean, that's typical mentality of the critical scholars. No way to prove John. You can prove Mark by Matthew, Or Matthew by Luke, or Luke by Mark. How can you prove John? He doesn't agree. Rarely ever agrees, as we'll see with some statistics here in a moment, with the other three gospel writers. That's why, now I said this on Friday night, but it really fits in here also in New Testament studies. Whenever John refers to the Jews, that little two-phrase word, the Jews, he's referring to the leaders of religious Judaism in Jerusalem. He's not meaning like the Jewish people when he says the Jews. It's always a dark word, a pejorative term, like those Jews. The Jews is always a reference to religious leaders, the Sanhedrin in particular. That's not true in any of the other three Gospels. When Jesus talks about, or the others talk about the Jews over in the other three Gospels, it would mean what you would normally think. That the Jewish people, Jews versus Gentiles. That's not true in John's Gospel. John's Gospel has Jesus almost always, few exceptions to this. I think of one like in the early chapters or in chapter 7, but rarely is Jesus found anywhere but in Jerusalem. He's almost always in Jerusalem. He is rarely in Jerusalem in the other three Gospels. This is basic New Testament material, but it's something that even someone who's read the Gospels a whole lot doesn't necessarily know, because you're reading it for other purposes, and it hasn't clicked in on you yet that, well, I knew that John was different, but in what ways is he different? Well, he's telling a different story, and he's telling a different story a different way than the other writers. Now, whenever these synopses were being done, whenever one is done today, like Tatians or harmony with Tatians, then what you would want to do is find out, if I'm going to put this in chronological order, and even a synopsis will do that, what's the earliest thing? Well, you look at all four of the gospel writers, if you're going to use all four of them and not just the synoptics, and you try to draw the material together, even in your parallel columns or in a woven together narrative fashion. What would you suppose the first thing you'll find when you open Tatian's Diatessaron? John 1, verse 1. And then you go through John, first few verses there. That's the earliest thing that you could ask for in any of the Gospels. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was made, and the Word was God, and the world was made by Him, and the world knew Him not. You'll find those verses there. Then what do you think the next thing would be? All right, which one? Well, Luke goes back to Adam. His goes back further. So you get Luke's in there because it goes back to Adam. And then you've got to somehow get Matthew's in there, depending on if it's woven together or narrative or in parallel columns. You get Matthew's in there that goes back to Abraham. And then you start looking, well, what's the next thing? Well, you got to go early enough to get the nativity accounts in. You get the genealogies and you got to have the nativity accounts. Well, which one is the earliest? Well, you start comparing Matthew and Luke's. And then whenever John the Baptist is mentioned, I mean, his nativity account in Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, comes before the nativity account of Jesus. John was 6 months older than Jesus. So you get John's account in there, and then Jesus. And then you've got to stick in that little episode when Jesus was 12. That's one little thing that would fit in there. And then you've got to find when John starts his public ministry. And you start weaving all of that together. And you can't forget the first 4 verses of Luke, because they are historical references that don't fit into the earthly life of Christ. And you weave all of that together. And that's what you'll find here. Like, I'm sure even in this harmony, since it's going to put things in chronological order, you probably, I would guess, well, he's going to start with Luke. Then he goes to John. It'd be questionable where you want to put the first 4 verses of Luke. But Luke isn't part of the life of Christ. So he puts that first in Robertson's harmony. Then he goes to John 1, verses 1 to 18. And then he jumps over to the genealogies. And since he's not weaving them together as a narrative, you don't have to ask which one comes first. You just put both of them in parallel columns here. And you keep on your way all the way back to the crucifixion account and what happens after that. Now, there are some other ways in which the synoptic gospels agree. I just have basically given you right there, they agree on sequence. From the baptism of John through Galilean ministry to the final trip to Jerusalem. They agree in sequence, or the order of the story being told. They agree verbally, that is, in the way the stories are told on many, many occasions. They agree, and this is something that Bob Stein calls particular attention to, although the first example, the one he majors on in his book, I think is in gross error. But he calls particular attention to the fact that they agree on parenthetical statements. I don't know if we'll see it this morning. We'll see it this morning or later what he means by that. And he has a good point as long as you use the right scriptures for that. They agree on parenthetical statements. Well, I can tell you briefly what I mean by that now. We still haven't gotten to the synoptic question. You've got to understand all of this background. You understand what the question is. Some people call it a problem. I call it a question on the outline. It's just a question, not a problem. If we're saying that I wrote a gospel and that you wrote one, and I'm Matthew and you're Mark, and we're telling the story about Jesus, I guess our first impression of that would be, well, if it's a true story, then we're not going to be copying from one another. That'd be plagiarism there. We're going to be telling the story of Jesus as it came to us or as we saw it. Matthew happened to be on the scene. I think that Mark was sometimes, and we'll be able to prove that later. As we saw it, we're going to tell the story. What about, as you're telling the story, Jesus said such and such, such and such, such and such, and then you make a parenthetical statement that appears to be your own? Well, then what if another gospel writer makes the exact same parenthetical statement? Well, what that leads to immediately is either A copied from B or B from A, or both A and B copied from a common source. You couldn't come up in your mind with the same parenthetical statement to make. Or even if you're quoting someone else's statement, to cast their statement within parentheses would be a rather remarkable occurrence. Let me give you an example, the one that Stein used that I don't think is valid. If you turn over to Matthew, that would be 24. Matthew 24 and verse 15. This is found identically, word for word, verbally so, over in the Markan account. Matthew 24:15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, parenthesis, whoso readeth, let him understand. Matthew 24:15. Now, if you have a red letter edition, you probably have the parentheses in red letters, as though Jesus said it. Many, many scholars believe because it is cast in parentheses, it should be in black letters. The gospel writer is saying this to his own audience. He's quoting Jesus when Jesus said, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet, stand in the holy place, then, verse 16, let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. And Matthew wants to call particular attention to what Jesus just said in verse 15 for the benefit of his readers. So he puts in parentheses, whoso is reading this, whoever's reading this, Jesus quoting Daniel, who's ever reading this, let him understand. Mark has the exact same parenthesis. The exact same. Him that's reading this, let him understand. Well, how could both of them come up with the same parenthesis? Unless one borrowed from the other, or both borrowed from a common source. However, I don't think that this is valid at all, although many scholars believe that that should be black letters, that is Matthew and Mark talking in the parenthesis. I don't believe that's true. I believe the one who's talking in that parenthesis is Jesus. He is talking about reading, and he is talking about a book. But what he's talking about is the book of Daniel. He just mentioned that. Whoso readeth Daniel, let him understand. Not whoso readeth what is being said now. Jesus wasn't writing, he was speaking then. He couldn't have reference to his own words as though they were in a book. That'd have to be the human author, Matthew or Mark. But since he did just mention a book, Daniel, that is found in Daniel, the abomination of desolations, I think that the Lord is the one saying, whoever reads Daniel, let him understand. I think Daniel's statement is the original one. Jesus is quoting from him. Daniel's is the cryptic one, not Jesus' statement. So Matthew is not saying whoever's reading my gospel, let him understand what Jesus just said. Rather, Jesus is saying whoever's listening to me and goes to check in Daniel and he's reading Daniel, then let him understand what Daniel has to say. But then there is another account in the healing of the paralytic, as told in Matthew 9, where we have a parenthesis found not only in Mark 2, but in Luke 5, found in all of the Synoptic Gospels. We have a parenthetical statement. We'll look at that later. And that is not due to some earlier book that's being quoted. That's due to the original account that's being given there. And we'll look at that when we arrive at the question. So now that we've got our harmonies, now that we have our synopses, we've got the gospel is understood in 4 different ways. 3 of them are very similar. 1 of them is very different. Those that are similar to one another are also different from one another. And so the synoptic question really concerns this, the similarities and the differences of the 3 gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this question, or really it's many questions, these questions, it could be better phrased, these synoptic questions, date all the way back to the early centuries of the Christian church, although it was not then called the synoptic question. It's a question of differences and similarities. In the early church, the questions were basically those regarding differences. If we have 3 gospel writers who are telling the same story, then how do we end up with such differences? You might say, well, it's just, 3 different men, they're telling it a different way. All right, what if they're quoting Jesus? Jesus said, and then they quote him. Matthew gives one quotation, Mark gives another, and Luke gives another. Did he say it all 3 different ways? That's highly unlikely. When you're quoting the same statement made at the same occasion, not a duplicate, not something that happened twice, like the casting out of the money changers in the temple, that happened on 2 occasions. John tells one of them, and the other gospel writers tell the other one. 2 different accounts of that, because it happened 2 different times. What if you're quoting a statement that was made only one time? Like at Jesus' baptism, whatever the Father said to him. How is it said in Matthew versus Mark versus Luke? And they're purporting this is a quotation of God the Father. What if your words differ? You could say, well, it's difference of personality. Well, you really can't say that. Either you're quoting someone or you're not quoting it. Are you giving us God's words or your own paraphrase of them? That was a very significant question. By the 18th century, the synoptic question had switched to questions regarding similarities. To questions regarding similarities. Why are, for instance, Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar? Did they borrow from one another? You see, the early church really didn't camp out with similarities. It camped out with differences, trying to explain the differences because they believed that these accounts were verbally inspired. 18th century is not that concerned with inspiration and differences. It's concerned with similarities. How can we explain the similarities? And so one of the best ways to see this is to, let me give you what they call Westcott's tabulation, done by Westcott, B.F. Westcott, the Greek scholar, where you set up with a little diagram the differences and agreements among the 4 gospel writers. So if you would set it up on your paper this way, then I'll give it to you the way I have it written. You have over on the left-hand side Matthew, then Mark, Luke, and we'll even give John, although he's not a synoptic. That goes up and down the left-hand side. Then across the top of the page, differences and agreements. Now this isn't 100% exact, but Westcott's tabulation is very close to being exact, and it's the one that's generally quoted. So then we've got to fill in differences for Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and agreements for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we'll start up here. Differences, Matthew. 42%. Now what that means is that 42% of Matthew's gospel differs from what is found in the other writings. Agreements, 58%. Mark, differences, 7%. Agreements, 93%. Luke, differences, 59%. Agreements, 41%. John, differences, 92%. Agreements, 8%. Now, two things should really stand out to you on that little chart. And that would be Mark and John, either differences or agreements. Look at your numbers there. Matthew and Luke we're not concerned about. It's kind of half and half with them. That's no big deal right there. The big thing, and this helps, this is where statistics or percentages really help, because it's shocking. You wouldn't know this really otherwise. You'd have a feeling for the fact one is similar, one is different. And my guess would be you'd have a feeling for the differences of John more than you would the similarities of Mark. 92% of the material found in John is not found in any of the other Gospels. 92, that's almost saying everything. 92%. 8% is. Now watch the reverse, the inverse of that in Mark. In Mark, 93% of Mark is found in at least one of the other Gospels. Almost all of Mark is found in at least one of the other Gospels. Practically none of John is. What do we get from that? Well, we could get a whole lot of things, but this has been the basic conclusion. And that is Mark must have the priority in order of being written, since so much agreement exists between him and the other gospel writers. In other words, he came first and others followed copying him. John is kind of difficult to explain on any type of literary theory of chronology, because you would just say, I guess John just lived in probably on a different planet. I don't know whether he came earlier or later or when. He just lived on a different planet. He's so unlike the other gospel writers. And so they just throw John out and say, well, he's unreliable. And we'll just talk about the three synoptic gospels. So on the basis of this tabulation from Westcott, let me state in conclusion this morning, this is all we're going to have time to do, it looks like, let me state in a twofold way the synoptic question. So you'll have it down precisely on your paper, since I know I've rambled a little bit this morning, and you'll have something to think about. There are lots of other related questions, but here I'm going to sum it up in a twofold way. Number one, if the synoptic gospels are totally independent of each other, then how can we explain the many similarities? Look at that 93% agreement in Mark. How can we explain the many similarities, even to verbal agreement in places? I mean, two similar test papers would cause suspicion in most cases, would they not? Especially if those test papers were not multiple choice. They were written essays, which is exactly what the Gospels are. Two similar test papers would cause suspicion in the teacher's mind. And you've got very similar papers before us. Another way of stating the question, if they, on the other hand, have a literary relationship to each other, then how can they claim to be independent witnesses of the gospel, and how may we explain the differences? You see, one question is a question of similarity, and the other question is one of differences. And that's always what the synoptic issue boils down to. It's a question over similarities and differences. We know that there are similarities. Because there are, that brings up certain questions. We know there are differences. We know that. Because there are, that brings up certain questions. So I'll state that again for you. Number one, if the synoptic gospels are totally independent of each other, like you would just think, I would assume on first reading, Matthew wrote Matthew, and Mark wrote Mark, and Luke wrote Luke. I mean, I wrote a paper, you wrote a paper, you wrote a book, I wrote a book, they wrote a book. If we're talking about three, now we're really not talking about John, we're talking about the synoptic question here. If they are three totally independent works, books, totally independent of each other, how may you explain the similarities? It's a question of similarities. You see, as soon as you got the three Gospels bound in one volume, and you got them together, and you got familiar enough with them, these questions started popping up in your mind right away then. If Matthew is Matthew, and Mark is Mark, and Luke is Luke, then how can we explain the many similarities, even to verbal agreements in many places? I'll say it again, two test papers with essay questions that are very similar would cause suspicion in a teacher's mind. I thought that was a test paper by John, and now here's one by Mike, and they're answering essay questions, and they're long answers. You see, on a short one, well, that we could just say, well, they got it from the same teacher. That's why they're saying the same thing. But why in such lengthy material are they reporting things verbally the same? We say, well, they're quoting Jesus. All right, what about those times they aren't quoting him? They're just telling a story that one day Jesus went, and as he came into, then such and such happened. Well, one of the answers is, well, if you're reporting history, you're reporting history. Either it happened that way or it didn't happen that way. But we're still losing sight of the fact that oftentimes you find verbal agreement there. Verbal agreement. Minute verbal agreement of stories being told, leading up to something Jesus said or did. How may we explain the similarities? The second part to that question, if, on the other hand, they have a literary relationship, then how can they claim to be independent witnesses of the gospel? And how may we explain the differences?